from Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's what's ahead. K-State's Glynn Tonsor with his latest thoughts on the cattle market trends. He'll remark on the relatively minimal impact of the Russia-Ukraine situation on the cattle market, and he'll pass along the beef demand data from his latest Meat Demand Monitor national survey. Then K-State's Gregg Hanzlicek will go over a health management checklist for you cow-calf producers preparing to turn your herds out on Summer Pasture in the coming weeks. He'll run through, among other things, the recommended vaccination protocols for cows, calves, and bulls. And K-State's Jenny Ifft continues her series on price risk management for cow-calf operations. All that straight ahead on Agriculture Today. Welcome once more. You are listening to Agriculture Today. And our Monday edition begins on the cattle markets. Along the way once more, livestock economist Glynn Tonsor of K-State Research and Extension. Well, Glynn, of course, at some point here will reference the war on Ukraine and what effect, if any, it's having on the cattle trades. But looking back to last week's markets, well, steady as she goes by and large, right?
Yeah, overall I would call it steady, and certainly compared to the week or two before. So let's just walk through the numbers here. So the cash market, AMS called fed cattle 139. That's $2 different from the April live cattle contract. Not much of action this past week there. I'll hone in real quick, just give some context about what has happened year to date on each contract, because I think that's important. So I just said April live cattle was 141. It's worth noting it was 148 on February 9th. I purposely went a couple weeks before the Russian invasion. So, yeah, we're off a little bit from then. But it's important to note that it was only 144 on January 3rd. So even the nearby contracts aren't off a lot from where we were earlier in the year. When we look at cash feeder cattle, AMS called the Pratt market on Thursday mixed, and it depended on the weight class. So the lighter weights, so think those under 600, 650 here, AMS said we're down $2 to $5. Those that are heavier weights above 650 were $2 to $6 higher. What I think we still see playing out is higher cost of gain being expected. We're seeing the price weight slide in feeder cattle shifting around. 2 lot examples for our listeners. 154 head lot weighing 635 sold for 186. Heavier lot at 775 sold for 160, just for some quick context. What about on the board? Again, let's use the April contract. So feeder cattle was 163, is actually up $4 for the week. It is down $10 from mid-February as well as earlier in January. This is where I want to interweave another point, though, is most of our listeners know we have futures contracts for multiple months during the year. I've referenced the April so far, but if you look further out to, and let's pick the October one, the futures market for October has not moved nearly as much as April, and this is pretty much what an economist would expect. So the nearby, the March-April time period is the one that has been the most disrupted by what's going on in the Russia-Ukraine arena, primarily the concerns on the grain feed cost front spill over a little bit into macroeconomic activity, but that's sort of a known for the month of March, and it's expected to continue in the weeks ahead, if you like. I think there's some embedded optimism that maybe as we get into the fall, the current shocks that we're having with Russia-Ukraine will be behind us and or mitigated some. And why am I highlighting that is those fall contracts have not declined nearly as much as the nearbys. And I'm also highlighting it because I'm not in the business of saying this producer should hedge or this one shouldn't or whatever. Mm-hmm. But the October feeder cattle contract is not off much from where it was earlier in the year. And by extension, the fairly high offering prices, if you're a feeder cattle seller, are still there. Now, of course, your cost of producing that animal went up. So the profitability of being in the business is a different statement. But just output price risk management, there's still fairly high levels that are there to be had if one was interested. The cost of locking them in is up because volatility in the market is up. But I'm really trying to drive home the point here, Eric, is the nearby market is quite different than the fall market. And most of that is because the shock is sort of known right now with Russia-Ukraine. We don't know if it's going to ease, and there's some hope, I think, that it's going to ease as we go in the months ahead.
Well, any element of stability is welcome in these circumstances, of course. What's the latest on the demand side as you look at the cutout?
Yeah, so the choice cutout on Friday was $2.60, is up about $5 from the Friday before, and then select was $2.52, up about $3 from the week before. So the fact those are up is good. There's been a lot of commentary there. I'm going to get to breaking down the market channels in a moment in my demand numbers, but if those numbers could firm up, and some are anticipating they'll actually come up as we turn to grilling season and so forth, that would be a good thing. There's going to be some supply tightness in the beef industry as we proceed throughout the rest of the year. There's reason for optimism if general macroeconomic conditions can hold on, that we'll see the cutout come back up, and possibly with that pull fed cattle prices back up. So, watch that in the weeks ahead.
Glynn, you were a participant in a recent series on the economic impact, agricultural economy now, of Russia, Ukraine here in the U.S., and there is, in fact, an archive of those presentations folks can go back and look at. But once more, the cattle side isn't immune to any of this, but it seems to have been able to separate itself some from it.
Yeah, and some of that is timing. So this is never a fortunate time for an event like this, so please don't overreact to my comment. Mm-hmm. But the supply fundamentals are quite supportive in the cattle industry. So we have fewer hooves, and we sort of know we're going to have fewer hooves. Drought pressure aside, we can talk about that separately, but just aggregate size of the herd is supportive from the supply side. As well as going into this, demand was quite strong, both domestically and abroad. So if there was a time of quote-unquote strength to absorb a adverse shock, it was the month of February and March here in 2022, if you like. That gives some staying power to the higher prices we've seen. And most of the effects, I say, are indirect. So they're indirect on feed cost. Dan O'Brien was one of them also on that series with me, so he laid that out. You can get these full videos on Ag Manager, as you've alluded to. But the part I really drove home, and I don't want to do it for 20 minutes here, but is my biggest concern for the U.S. cattle and beef industry as it relates to Russia-Ukraine is, will that conflict lead to speeding up in stepping away from globalization? So will we step away from more international commerce as a result? And why is that relevant? A very simple statistic. For the year 2021, my numbers, taking USABF, so United States Meat Export Federation's numbers, my best estimate is 22% of the value of steers and heifers that were sold, you could trace it back to exports. And that's well above the volume share. So the value we're adding to the industry well exceeds the volume because markets are at work. And I always use tongues, but tongues, short rims, short plates, there's a lot of products that we export a lot of. As we run the risk of stepping away from trade, we shrink the world, we shrink the market for U.S. beef, and that would not be good for U.S. cattlemen. So that's what I belabored in that video series. But if you're interested in more details and charts and so forth on that, I encourage you to go to Ag Manager, not just for my take on the livestock market, but as I said, for Dan O'Brien's on grains and for other talks as well.
It's a great series, agmanager.info. Have a look. But keeping it more to the domestic, your latest meat demand monitor numbers, this was for the month of February now, of course, and the indicators there seem to be encouraging.
They are on balance, and it's different by market channel. So remember, the meat demand monitor, it's joint project, beef, pork, checkoff, ongoing survey effort, gives me a fairly current pulse on the domestic industry, if you like. The food service message is good for February. So food service demand was up for every product we looked at. So ribeye steak, ground beef, pork chops, go down the list. Those that we looked at were all up from January and up from the year before. When you flip it over to retail, so think grocery store for at-home consumption, then it was more of a mixed bag. So demand for ground beef in February was up from January, but several other products, including ribeye steak and pork chops, were down from January. But that's where if you compare January versus the year before, you get a different story. So there was a little bit of seasonal pullback, if you like, in February at the grocery store, but we're still well above where we were before, the year before. So we entered 2022, whether we're talking food service or retail, with a much stronger meat demand story than we had 2021. I tried to set that stage earlier when we talk about the Russia-Ukraine ability to absorb it, if you like. U.S. consumers have reaffirmed their affinity for meat, and we continue to see that in aggregate. I also want to interject here. There's a lot of discussion about inflation. So, the role of energy prices is not immune to Russia-Ukraine. I don't want to talk about Russia-Ukraine forever, but we can't ignore it on some of these things. Right. Food inflation is a component of that, not just gas inflation. And I've been trying to track in this meat demand monitor what consumers' expectations for meat prices the next month. So what do they think they're going to be? I've been doing that since about March of 2021. And so far, those expectations, they peaked back in November. So we're sitting here doing this interview in the middle of March. About 2 weeks from now, I'll know what in March people are thinking for April. It's going to be important to watch that. Have consumers turn more pessimistic with the Russian-Ukraine event and broader inflation in our economy until they start anticipating higher prices again? Or was that November truly a peak? I interject that here because it's not just useful for me to track that, but broader is consumer sentiment and staying power of domestic meat demand still there? I hope it is, and there's still some good signs, but there's also clouds on the horizon on the macroeconomic front that are worth monitoring.
How do these numbers compare briefly here with the USDA's latest account on demand?
Yeah, so the USDA numbers, they're slightly different, mainly in the timing. So the latest I have available is for the month of January, and these are no longer survey-based, is why it's worth watching both of these. But for January here of 2022, domestic beef demand fell 1% compared to December, but was up a full 12% compared to January 2021. So they reinforced basically what I just said, just for 1 month earlier. Most importantly, from August of 2021, which is the month of my birthday, so it's a glorious month, of course, listeners, through January of 2022, demand has been up compared to the year before. So, if you do the math on that, 5 months in a row, we had stronger demand than the year before domestically. That is good. I also track export meat demand using similar USDA data. Now we're talking FAS, and export demand in January for beef was up 1% compared to December, but a full 34% compared to the January before. And again, export demand for U.S. beef has been up since April of 2021 when we do a year-over-year pulse on this. This is directly related to my concern earlier about stepping away from globalization. 2021 was a great year for U.S. beef exports. There's reason for optimism as we go through 2022 that will sustain. Even if we don't sustain the same volume, maybe the value will stay at an elevated level just because we're opening markets and there's consumers in certain pockets of the world that are reaffirming their interest in buying U.S. beef. I hope that continues. It needs to continue to support the size of the U.S. beef industry that many of our listeners want.
In conclusion here, the markets seem to be in something of a comfort zone at present.
Yeah, if I put a bow around everything I just threw at you, and I know there's a lot of numbers, is this past week was a fairly calm week given the existence of all the uncertainty in Europe. I look forward to a couple more weeks of calm. That would be a wonderful, wonderful thing for the industry.
You bet. Appreciate your comments, as always. Thanks for coming by.
Thanks for having me on, Eric.
On the cattle markets, Glynn Tonsor, livestock economist, K-State Research and Extension. Keep up on his latest thinking on these markets at agmanager.info. We'll be back on Agriculture Today. Welcome back. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Well, cow-calf producers, we are pushing very steadily now toward that point when you'll turn the cow herd out on grass. Are those critters ready for that in a health sense? That's what we'll talk about today in our latest visit with Gregg Hanzlicek from the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory here at Kansas State University. He heads up the Production Animal Field Investigations Unit. First off, the cows themselves. What sort of preventative vaccination schedule one wants to put them through? Talk about that, Gregg.
Well, number one, we're going the breeding season. I mean, that's what the pasture is for spring calving cows. And so we need to protect those cows against the major reproductive infectious diseases. And so we want to protect them against IBR, the 2 BVDs, lepto, and then the V on our vaccine stands for Vibrio. It's actually a new name called Campylobacter, but those are the 4 organisms that we actually want to protect those cows from during that breeding season to maximize our efficiency there.
What about the timing of that treatment? You say that's something that needs to be contemplated here.
Yeah, so we've always said in the past that we want those vaccines to go in those cows, and it can be killed or modified live 30 to 45 days before bull turnout or before we AI them, because we need to give them enough time to respond. And there are some mild and transitory negative impacts of especially modified live on the fertility. But some of the latest information from some of our bovine immunologists suggests that it shouldn't be 30 to 45 days. It should be 45 to 60 days before the breeding season. So that just means we have to start a little bit earlier in the spring before we go to pasture.
So think about that and maybe start lining these things out pretty quickly here. The bull power, does it need attention to in the vaccination sense?
Absolutely, and I really think that sometimes we forget about the bulls. whether it's deworming or fly control or vaccinations. But it is important to protect them against these same diseases. And so easy recommendation is to just treat the bulls like you do the cows. Use the same vaccine, use the same vaccination schedule, and that helps protect them. And everybody knows you have a bull that goes bad or becomes infertile or whatever due to a disease, the impact on the herd is a lot more than one cow that becomes infertile. And so, yeah, we need to make sure those bulls are getting the right vaccination program.
Aligned with that, running that bull breeding soundness examination.
Well, breeding soundness examination, we're not going to identify bulls that are sterile. What we're trying to do is identify those bulls that are less fertile and to get them out of the herd before the breeding season. So it has a lot of limitations. All we can do is look at the sperm particularly and some of the anatomy of the bull. What it won't assess is the libido of the bull and the bull's ability to actually do the breeding. And so we recommend do the breeding soundness exam, and then when the producer's out in the pasture checking calves and cows for health, make sure you're watching the bulls, make sure that they have the desire to breed and the fact that they can anatomically also breed, because we have several cases of that every year.
There's value in that visual observation then.
There absolutely is. Yep.
What about the calves on mama cow or first calf heifer? What do they need in the way of vaccinations heading to grass, if anything?
Well, I think the baseline, most people would say let's give them the Clostridium 7-way to protect them against some of the purple gut, the overeating, and those kind of things. If herds that have had problems with, unfortunately, a more common and relatively new health issue called pasture pneumonia or pre-breeding pneumonia, those herds are probably going to need to do something different as far as vaccination for those calves. We don't have that disease figured out. So to say that there's a baseline or a blanket vaccination program is wrong. Just recommend that they work with their veterinarian and say, hey, we have this problem when we go to pasture or later in the pasture season. What can we do vaccination-wise to prevent it?
Yeah, respiratory concerns should be considered here then.
And it is a respiratory disease, so whether they add the Mannheimias and the Pasturellas and some of those respiratory organisms, that's between them and the veterinarian.
Well, Gregg, beyond vaccinations, mineral supplementation for the herd, extremely important as they are out on grass. What should be included in that plan?
Well, it's the density of the mineral as far as the minerals and especially the vitamins doesn't really need to be that high because the grass is going to take care of it. And I'm talking primarily vitamin A and vitamin E. So to save some dollars, a lot of us would just say, let's put the minimum amount of A and E in the mineral because the grass is going to have more and ample enough. Now, we have to make sure that the mineral has enough copper and zinc because those two trace minerals are very important for the integrity of the skin and the eyes. And so those are important to help prevent foot rot and pink eye. But as far as the vitamins, put those at a minimum. And then as we get into the later stages of the pasture where they start turning brown, that tells us that the vitamin E and the vitamin A is actually not there anymore. That's the time to bring back a more dense mineral. And so it's a cost savings thing, and then the cows really don't need a fancy or a high dollar mineral during the early pasture season.
And the mineral product can be a vehicle for parasite control, and that would be something to think about here too. That's
a great point, is that, yeah, if for those producers that are wanting to feed the larvicides or the insect growth regulators for fly control, we know that cows need to have access to those 3 or so weeks before the fly season, so that's the perfect time to start getting those kind of minerals out there for fly control.
Assuring, though, that there is consumption of the product.
Well, and that's anytime we have free choice of anything for cattle, that's always a concern. And most of these minerals are made for a cow to eat 2 to 4 ounces a day. The consumption is going to go up. It's going to go down. It depends a lot on what's going on in the grass. But overall, they should be consuming 2 to 4 ounces a day. If they're not, we can have the best mineral we want, but if they're not consuming, it's not doing anybody any good. And
you say that producers should double down as well on their fly control with insecticidal ear tags.
Yes, insect growth regulators and larvicides by themselves, they're very, very helpful, but we're going to need, the old fly tags. It's still probably the best bang for your buck. There's some really good guidelines out there that if we're going to use those products, which we recommend people do, that we tag the cows. Research has shown 2 tags are much, much more effective than 1. And I recommend don't forget the bulls. If it's safe and you can catch a bull, I'd put a couple ear tags in those bulls too, because they carry an awful lot of flies. And then the recommendation is if we've got pastures where we have a major fly problem, we've got pink eye on our calves, it may be necessary to tag them, but for most of us, we're going to start with the cows.
And key to that, and we've spoken about this before, but it's worth reiterating, rotating the chemistry of those tags.
Absolutely. So we know we're building resistance in flies because we're using the same products year after year. And what happens, it kills the flies that are susceptible to those products. But the ones that aren't susceptible, they're the ones that are breeding. And so in time, our fly control becomes very inefficient. And so, yeah, if there's a couple rotations out there, if a herd's using just the pyrethroids and the organophosphates, we recommend they go pyrethroid, 2 years in a row, then go to an organophosphate, and then go back to 2 years of pyrethroids. If they're using a 3 chemical rotation, then they'd go organophosphate, pyrethroid, and then avermectin's the 3rd year. The point is just keep those products rotating so that we're not building resistance.
Keep that resistance off balance, as it were. And one final thing here in prepping for turnout, deworming those cows, heifers, bulls, all of the above.
Yes, it's really important that we do something, and what we're trying to do is protect the calves from ingesting enough internal parasites that it affects their performance. In the past, we just concentrated on, every cow as they go to pasture, we're going to deworm them. Our dewormers only last about 14 to 30 days, and so it's short-lived. There's some longer-acting injectables that'll go up to 100-plus days. But the point is that because we're seeing so much resistance with our ivermectins with internal parasites, it's recommended that we do not deworm all the cows as we go to pasture. There's a term called refugia, and to have refugia in our herd, then that recommendation is just deworm those that are under 5 years of age. Those cows that are over 5, they have an immunity to the worms. They're not going to carry a heavy burden, and the worms they're producing will remain susceptible to the products we're using, and so we're not building resistance.
And do you want to use more than one dewormer to alter things up?
Yes, so that's another great thing to do is that, because we have so much resistance to our ivermectins out there, that the best bang for your buck would be to use 2 different classes of dewormer. And so your favorite injectable Reporon, Ivomec, whatever you want to use, but also in addition to that, use what we call a white dewormer. And there's 3 products out there, and those are the oral dewormers. So we'd want an oral dewormer and then an injectable Reporon at the same time. And that's not only are we they act on different worms at different stages, we'll do a lot better job of keeping the pastures clean, but we're going to reduce the amount of resistance also.
Well, in our time here, we've covered multiple aspects of readying the cow herd for grass turnout. These are good guidelines for the producers to follow. Gregg, thank you for coming over, as always. He's from the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory here at Kansas State University, Gregg Hanzlicek, and he's with us monthly to talk bovine health management on Agriculture Today. We're back now on Agriculture Today, and we're moving forward with our series for you cow-calf producers on price risk management for your operations. And again, contributing to this is Jenny Ifft, a risk management specialist, K-State Research and Extension. And the last couple of times out, we've been talking about the Livestock Risk Protection Insurance program available to livestock producers and cow-calf producers included there. What we want to do is get into some of the nitty-gritty of participating in the LRP. And one of the things that's unique about this program, you say, Jenny, is the time window during which one can actually take out a policy. Talk about that.
Right. At the end of market, when futures markets close around 3:30 during the week, they publish a schedule of LRP coverage prices and premium costs. And those can change from day to day. So that's going to be new information or updated information And from that time until 9 a.m. the next day is the time you have to actually buy a policy, or with LRP, it's called an endorsement, to buy an LRP endorsement.
While the futures markets are not moving, so to speak.
Yes. So you have that short window. Before that time, a producer needs to have a good idea of what prices are acceptable and at what cost, so that you can actually digest or analyze that information and see if you want to go ahead and purchase an endorsement. And because of this, it's really important that a producer has a good relationship with their livestock insurance agent, because the agent can be a part of making that plan in advance, but the agent also potentially has to be available outside of regular business hours to make sure, if the producer wants to go ahead, that they can buy that endorsement in time.
So one has to do their homework and be prepared to quite literally pull the trigger on a moment's notice.
Yes, exactly.
So that's one nuance of the coverage that may differ from other insurance products that you're familiar with. There's something called the endorsement length associated with LRP. What is that, Jenny?
Right. So it's the length of time between when you buy a policy and when you plan to market or when you plan to sell. So right now, for feeder cattle specifically, it can go out to 34 weeks or 8 months. Some LRP policies go longer, but right now for feeder cattle, it's 8 months out.
That's the maximum, right?
That's the maximum. The minimum is 3 months out. So that's the time range that you can buy it. One of the important things to know with that is if you buy it closer to when you intend to market, it's going to cost less. The reason it costs less is because there's less price volatility. There's less likelihood of a price decline when you get closer to your intended marketing date. So the longer endorsements are providing more protection. There's more that can go. Likelihood the markets can go down. The longer out you go, that comes at a cost.
But the payouts would be correlated with that as well.
Definitely.
The shorter endorsements, lesser payouts,
Yes.
longer endorsements, greater payouts. Yes. And it is a flexible kind of thing that cow-calf producers can potentially dovetail into their normal mode of operation.
Right. And there's all kinds of examples of how cow-calf producers, as a part of their normal management, they may sell earlier than intended. They may hold their feeders longer than intended based on local conditions, forage availability, corn prices, things like that. So with LRP, there's some flexibility, but not complete flexibility. And it's really important to understand this.
What are the limitations then?
So you can't sell your feeders more than 60 days before the end of your endorsement. So you can't sell them more than 2 months before. Then you basically are forfeiting an indemnity. Now, there's potential to get an exception to this, but that's sort of a detail you got to talk to your agent about. So generally, you're not supposed to sell your livestock 60 days before the end of the endorsement. However, there is some flexibility because you don't actually have to sell at the end of your endorsement. If you want to hold them longer, that's fine.
In our last segment of the series, which will be next week, you want to talk about management objectives on the part of each cow-calf operation and how this coverage would fit in?
Yes.
Very good. We'll get into that next week. Jenny, we'll have you back then. Thank you. Jenny Ifft, Risk Management Specialist with K-State Research and Extension. By the way, Jenny has a write-up that covers this angle on LRP, found at agmanager.info. So goes our Monday edition. Thanks for being along with us. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.